Hello, and welcome to the Parent Educational Workshop. It's for attention. I'm very happy to introduce to you today Tammy Bronstein, who has a master's in special education from George Mason University and is a teacher with Fairfax County Public Schools, including having taught in the preschool autism classroom. And Thanh Ka, who is a board certified assistant behavior analyst with BCaBA. So thank you both for your presentation today. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Tan and Tammy.
So these responses were from our workshop, some kind of things that we came up with that some parents have seen and other practitioners have seen when it comes to what attention maintained behaviors look like. It can look like whining, yelling, running away, tapping on the table, taking Pierce's toys, repeating name over and over again, looking at you, getting in your face, climbing on things, falling down, throwing items on the ground, refusing to do something they typically do, spontaneous hugs, refusing to eat. It can look very different. And then next, we talked about what kind of things that we've tried when it comes to attention maintained behaviors.
Yes, when we look at things that we've tried for attention maintained behaviors, one of the big responses we got was ignoring. And we heard from parents, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work. And so our purpose today is to talk about a couple of different interventions that we can look at for these behaviors that kids do for attention and figuring out, what might work for your family and what might work for you.
So from our discussions, the consensus is that attention maintained behaviors look differently. The things that your kid does to get attention will look different depending on your kid and their learning history. So we find it more useful to focus on what happens after a behavior happens. So if what your child does gets attention and they continue to do it, then attention may be one of the things that's keeping that behavior going. Some common reactions to attention maintained behaviors are reprimands, laughing, teasing, praise, swearing, eye contact, slight changes in expression, and people running towards them, and so on. Something to pay attention to is that attention alone is not usually the only reinforcer. There are many things that we can get or get away from when we have somebody else's attention, especially in the case of a child and a caregiver, and the caregiver's role is to help with the child's needs. So as a caregiver, you can provide help, escape, mood regulation, fun, food, and so many other things. An example of this situation is when two siblings are fighting and they're calling out for you, the parent, to come over. They're most likely not calling you over to watch them fight, but they want you to resolve the conflict. So in that situation, their yelling gets your attention and it ends the aversive situation, the conflict. So you would reinforce, the reinforcers that you provide would be attention and ending the aversive situation. In this explanation, it seems like these are useful behaviors for your child. So why would we want to change it? Well, at the very least, these behaviors can be annoying or disruptive, and it becomes even more concerning when the behaviors escalate into being destructive or dangerous. And some parents have even told us they know to not do it. Why are they doing it? And they do it because it works. With annoying or disruptive behaviors, it's easier not to reinforce, but sometimes you're tired and you've had a long day and you just can't handle the whining, so you give them what they want. And we've all done that. Or you've tried ignoring and behaviors escalate to a level where it's intolerable or it's not safe, and you have to reinforce to stop it. And then you end up reinforcing that whole period of time and all those behaviors in between. With destructive and dangerous behaviors, we can't ignore those. You have to attend to it, and caregivers often feel like they're in a situation where they have no choice but to reinforce. And so in either case, reinforcers make the behavior more likely to happen in the future in similar situations. And then it puts you in the cycle where your child engaged in behaviors that affect your family's well-being or functioning, and then you have to reinforce it, or you sometimes give in, and then the behavior happens more because of the reinforcement, and then it gets reinforced again, and then it just keeps going on. Next, we'll talk about how we can start breaking the cycle.
All right, so first we want to look at some components to consider when you're choosing what to do. So when you're choosing an intervention, really for any behavior, but right now, we're looking at those behaviors that a child might do for attention. These are some components. So first you want to think about who is part of your child's daily life, right? As a teacher, I've heard, parents tell me multiple times, yeah, I can ignore that behavior, or yeah, I can treat the behavior like this, but grandma's with us a lot and grandma just can't, or dad just can't, or we have a 4-year-old brother at home and it's really hard for brother to treat it that way. We want to look at who is a part of your child's daily life, and we want to pick a strategy that's going to work the best for everybody who's a part of your child's life. The next thing we want to look at are what stressors are part of your daily life, right? And I think when we look at the state we're in right now with COVID, one of the big stressors I've seen the most often is that parents are working from home. And so a strategy to use for a behavior that's just for attention may be even harder to use while you're working from home and while you need to be on meetings, but your kid's right there. What is your workload? Are there other siblings that you need to tend to? Anything that you can think of that might be stressors that are part of your life. The next component is, can you follow through with what you decide to do, right? Whatever strategy it is that you pick in conjunction with your behavior analyst, you want to make sure you can see it through to the end, right? You want to be willing to not just try it once, to give it a couple of goes and to really follow through. The next one is, will it help your child build new skills, right? When we're looking at some strategies, we look at some strategies that might reduce behaviors, but we don't want to just reduce behaviors without teaching them appropriate ways to get that attention, because sometimes attention is really important, and sometimes you need attention for a bunch of different things, right? Whether it's attention for help, whether it's attention because you need an item, or just, in our typical days, all of us need a certain level of attention. Next is, how comfortable are you with the procedure, right? I always try to check with my students' parents, right? If I say, okay, I'm seeing this behavior, this is, one way that we could look at treating this behavior. How do you feel about that? Right? And sometimes I'll get the response, oh, I don't feel so great about that. Oh, that doesn't really work in our lives. That's okay, right? Be honest with your behavior analyst. If it's something you're not feeling totally comfortable with, and it's something that is hard to implement when your behavior analyst isn't there, we might want to look at choosing a different strategy. Next is, what are your child's current abilities, right? A strategy we might recommend for a student that's able to speak in full sentences, or a child that's able to speak in full sentences, may be different than a strategy we would recommend for a child who's still developing a communication system, who doesn't necessarily echo what you say. And then finally, is the behavior predictable? Does it happen at certain times of day, activities, people? We want to keep that in mind when we're picking a strategy, just so we can, really figure out if the primary, what the primary function and means of the behavior is.
Some of the types of interventions that we'll be discussing are ignoring, functional communication, reinforcing less intense behaviors, and kind of a combination of these and other inventions or interventions.
So the first strategy that we'd want to look at is ignoring. And the reason I wanted to talk about this one first is because of the fact that it is the one that comes up the most often, right? When I asked parents, what have you been told to do for this behavior that your kid's doing for attention? The number one thing that we've been told is ignore. I want to put it out there, But I do want to state that we do not recommend ignoring as a strategy because it is really, really hard to do in its entirety and correctly, and it doesn't usually focus on teaching new skills. But I want to define it for you first. So our definition of ignoring is to not provide any attention to the child for demonstrating the undesired behavior. But in that, we want to make sure we're ignoring the behavior and we're not ignoring the child, right? So say you have a child and the behavior that they most frequently do to get attention is screaming, right? Which, can be a frustrating behavior. And maybe you've been told in the past, hey, ignore this behavior, right? But when you're ignoring the behavior, you want to make sure you're ignoring actually when your child is doing the behavior. You want to make sure you're not accidentally ignoring your child at other times, right? So if your child is calm, or if your child, starts to say something appropriately, right? We want to ignore the behavior, not ignore the child if you're choosing an ignoring strategy. The other thing, if you're choosing an ignoring strategy is that the parent or whoever's implementing the strategy should find an alternative behavior, right? It's really hard to just sit there and ignore. I know for me, if I'm ever doing some intentional ignoring, right, that it's really hard for me not to just look at the child, right? You want to give yourself a behavior you can do in place. Maybe it's taking deep breaths, right, to calm yourself down. Maybe it's reading a book. Maybe it's scrolling through your phone. Something that you can do in place of, attending to the child for this behavior. But I want to note that if you and everyone can't ignore this behavior consistently, or if the behavior gets worse to a point where you really cannot ignore it, you should pick a different strategy. And I'm going to explain why. All right, so what happens when we ignore? So when we ignore, we are putting the behavior on what we call extinction. That means we're removing the reinforcer, in this case, attention, that maintain it, right? So say our behavior is yelling, just like I just described. So yelling, 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 right? What's going to happen if you start ignoring, right? If you're ignoring and your child wants your attention, they're going to yell, 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 and then they might try something else to get your attention when they realize the yelling didn't work. So maybe that's crying, maybe it's stomping, maybe it is pulling things off shelves, and then they're going to try something else to get your attention if that still doesn't work, right? Maybe it's, it could be breaking things, it could be running away, we don't know, right? I've worked with students in the past, right? They'll start with either a small yell, or maybe they start with a strong tap on the table, and then quickly it becomes, we're escalating and we get to this climb on the table, right? And then eventually, if we keep ignoring it, we're going to get to a point where the behavior just stops and the kid realizes, oh, I don't get attention for this, right? But we have to be able to get through that really, really tough time in order to get to this place at the end. We call this really tough time, the sharp curve over here, an extinction burst. That's a temporary increase in responding when the behavior is no longer reinforced, right? The way I also might like to think of an extinction burst, right, is when I have a bad connection on the phone with somebody, or over Zoom even. At first I'll start by talking nicely, then I'll say, are you there? Then I'll say, come on, can you hear me? Oh, come on, I can't believe it. And then maybe I'll even hang up the phone. I'll try to reconnect and I'll get really frustrated. And by the time I can actually connect with the person, I'm pretty angry. But maybe I'll eventually just give up and I'll realize, this isn't working, and I'll get to this place where I just stop trying, right? So that's an example of an extinction burst. What I also want to note is when you get to the other side of an extinction burst, you're getting to a point where your kid is just, stopping trying to get your attention, right? It's not that we're getting to a point, where, your kid has learned a new skill. Unless you've taught a new skill, they haven't learned it. So if you're going to try ignoring, right, you want to make sure you can see it through to the end. And then we're going to also talk about some other considerations that you want to make sure of if you're going to try ignoring. Oops, I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself. So some considerations before selecting ignoring as a strategy. The first one is, can everyone in your child's life implement the strategy? Right, like I've said, I've heard from parents who said, okay, I don't have a problem ignoring. I understand the behavior is going to get worse, but dad's on calls all day. and it's brothers in school, and it just gets so loud to a point where I just can't ignore it anymore because it's really interrupting their workday. Okay, well then ignoring is probably not a strategy for you, and that's okay. The next one is, can you keep yourself and your child safe by ignoring, right? My example of a kid who might climb on the table, a kid who might try to run away, someone who might break things, right? You're getting to a point where it's not really safe to ignore, right? We can't just allow our kids, to jump on tables. It's dangerous, right? So if we're getting to an unsafe point, better to not use ignoring as a strategy, because we won't be able to ignore those unsafe behaviors. What I want to state in regard to that, right? The reason ignoring is really hard, and I forgot to mention this, is that if you start getting to this unsafe behavior and you reinforce, you give that attention right when that unsafe behavior occurs, what your kid has learned is that, okay, yelling didn't work, crying didn't work, but I started breaking things. And when I started breaking things, that's when I got attention. Next time, I'm just going to break something. That's going to get me attention a lot faster. So if you reinforce up here, it is potentially reinforcing a dangerous situation and saying that a dangerous situation needs to happen for your kid to gain attention. So if you cannot ignore this part, please do not select ignoring as a strategy. And that goes into point number 3, right? Are you prepared for it to get worse before it gets better? Can you really, really ignore all the time? And, maybe the answer is no. That's okay. Probably not the strategy for you. Next, are you teaching an appropriate skill in addition to ignoring? Like I stated, when you're ignoring, you're just teaching your kid that attention's not available. But if you're teaching an appropriate skill in addition to ignoring, you're teaching them how to get that attention appropriately. And that is really, more useful than just ignoring. Then finally, are you certain this behavior is purely for attention, right? It's really hard to tease out if a behavior is only occurring for attention, right? We might want to get attention for a bunch of different things. You may need attention because you need help. You may need attention because you're hungry. You may need attention because you see something else happening on the side of the room that you want somebody else to pay attention to. So, ignoring is only, would only be something we would look at for a behavior that's really, really only for attention in its purest form, which is really hard to find. It's a behavior that's just reinforced because, just because they want someone else to look at them, right? If we've ignored, I accidentally, ignored behaviors in the past for a kid that just wanted someone to tie their shoe, right? And it's really hard to tease out. All they wanted was someone to tie their shoe. But if you'd ignore them, you've shown them, oh, you can't get anybody to tie your shoe and you can't get attention. So we just want to be careful.
And Tammy touched on this a little bit in the ignoring slides about if you're teaching an appropriate skill. And that would be strategy 2, functional communication. In this approach, we aim to teach appropriate communication to replace the unwanted behaviors. And some common phrases are, look at me, come here, help me, I'm done. These are general and they can be used for many situations. And for what types of phrase would be most useful for your kid, you can speak to your behavior analyst. It can, depending on the situation. I've had a client who, for the longest time, we thought this one behavior was for attention because it just made sense that the most common thing that happens after they did this thing was that people would come and try to stop them. And over time, it seemed like they were only doing this in activities that weren't the most preferred. So we started teaching them to say, I'm done, and mouthing went way down because they had a reasonable way to get out of a situation. And why would this work? The reason why this would work is research has shown that reinforcement works best when it is quick, easy, and of high quality and/or amount. So when your kid has learned that they can use these phrases to get to what they want, especially when it's easier and quicker than the challenging behaviors, they're more likely to use them. Saying a quick phrase is a lot easier and quicker than engaging in the series of behaviors, especially with a kid who's had a history of maybe being ignored, that could go on for a while, as opposed to just saying a phrase and getting what they need. This doesn't mean that when they learn this phrase that the challenging behaviors will stop immediately, because before the intervention, those behaviors are the only way they've known how to get what they want in that situation. So it's going to take some practice and some time. Another purpose of this intervention is to make the challenging behavior less effective in getting the reinforcer. So when we prompt functional communication and they're learning this new way of asking for what they want, there's a little bit of a delay before getting the reinforcer. So they would have to engage in this kind of behavior, and then you would prompt, and then they would say it, and then they would get it. So like it takes a little bit more effort than to just appropriately ask. So over time, as they're getting more fluent in that situation and using the phrase, it's more likely that they're just going to outright ask instead of going through the process of the behavior being prompted and then asking for what they want. And so we want to make the helpful behaviors easier and the challenging behaviors more difficult to do and to be reinforced. As Aubrey Daniels said in his book, Other People's Habits, behavior goes where reinforcement flows. So it's our job to make the right channels to helpful behaviors, to set up the environment and our responses in a way that when they do say the helpful behaviors, they get what they want quicker. And when the challenging behaviors happen, it's more difficult to get to what they want, or they don't get what they want at all, depending on the situation. A functional communication strategy would be good for a child with an already developed language system or a good ability to echo. So if you say, help me, and they'll say, help me right away without a lot of prompting, or they know how to use picture cards well, sign language, or an AAC device. This goes back into the whole low effort, easy, quick thing. If they're struggling to request already and using language, using this strategy would take way more effort for them to learn how to communicate, how to request, and then how to request in this particular situation where in the past they already had a way to communicate, even if it's not the way that's helpful right now, or like the way that they've been doing it has been more disruptive. And then some considerations for teaching functional communication, the current language level. So like we were saying, make sure the chosen phrases are attainable for your child. If they're regularly using one-word mans, but usually need to be prompted for sentences, we should probably stick with one-word mans. Look, help, hi, as opposed to having them say, can you come here? 2, will everyone in your child's life honor this communication, or can everyone in the child's life understand what they're asking for? And will they reinforce it? So that's something we can consider and we can plan for. If you know that if your child's communication isn't clear or pronunciation, you can talk to the people in their life and say, when they're saying this, they want you to come help them, or whatever the situation is. 3, are you available to be a listener? So in being a listener, it's not just hearing what they're saying, is being able to reinforce it. Can you implement the intervention? Can you listen to what they're saying and then follow through with the intervention? And during this busy time, are you able to reinforce their communication almost all of the time? And lastly, to consider having a plan to teach waiting and accepting no later on. It's not realistic or sustainable for us to expect that every single time your child asks for your attention or your help for the rest of their life that you will be available. So we would like to have a plan to work on waiting and accepting no. So accepting some delays or accepting outright denial when things are not possible. At the start, we have to do it as often as possible to build the skills. But when they're ready, we can start working on small delays and then denials. And your behavior analyst can help with this planning and determine when it's time to start waiting or accepting no goals.
All right, so our third strategy goes a little bit along with the functional communication strategy that Tan spoke about. And it's what we call reinforcing lower levels of behavior. So this would be looking at a prerequisite or a precursor to a really challenging attention-seeking behavior. We would reinforce the low-level behavior and then help turn that behavior into something more appropriate. So if you really, look at a student or look at your child, there's sometimes little things that you can see where okay, this is going to happen. And then if I don't give in, it's going to get really bad. One of the ones I've seen in the past is I've had a student that would just tap on the table. He would tap really hard on the table. And if you didn't give him that attention at that point, that's when we would get out of our seat, or that's when we would try climbing or try running away. That prerequisite behavior, right? Not really a big deal in and of itself, just tapping on a table. Kind of annoying, didn't really love it, not super appropriate, but it's not gonna hurt anybody, right? So if you just reinforce that low level of behavior, we'll talk a little bit about why that might work. Other, behaviors I've seen is maybe a small kick, nothing that's gonna hurt anybody, just a little kick, or maybe a tap on the shoulder, nothing that's going to hurt anybody, just a little tap. So you would have to pay attention to your child to see if you can find any of these precursor behaviors. Here's an example, right, of how we could turn these precursor behaviors into more functional types of communication. So one example is that small hit on the shoulder, right? Well, an appropriate way that we might get attention from a friend or from someone we know is to just tap somebody on the shoulder. So maybe we can work on turning that small hit on the shoulder into a little tap on the shoulder. Another one is a quieter scream, something like an ah, right? I've seen that before from a couple of students. We can start to turn what we call shape that quieter scream into something more appropriate, even for some of our very early communicators. So maybe instead of ah, we could teach look or hey, right? Hey doesn't sound too far from ah, or hi, right? So turning that quieter scream into a little bit of a more functional type of communication. Another one, right, one that we see often in the classroom is starting to run away, right? Where that turns into a little game of chase, but you can kind of see that first initial look at the door before a child takes a step. And maybe instead of that running away, we turn it into a turn and look at an adult or a going to seek an adult, right? Maybe we teach if you go to an adult, you'll definitely get an adult's attention, right? And we start to teach that right at that very moment we see that running away starting to happen. Here's why this would work, right? We talked a little bit about what we call this extinction burst curve. When we put a behavior on extinction, right? So let's pretend, our lower level behavior is that yelling, right? Not going to hurt anybody, kind of frustrating, kind of annoying, right? If we just reinforce at this point, we totally get rid of the child's need to cry, to break, to get out of their seat, to run away, to climb, whatever it is that gets really bad to the point where we can't ignore it. They don't need to try it, right? They don't need to give any of those behaviors a test because their yelling worked, right? Is our end game for their yelling to work? No, but it's a good starting point for us to reinforce this yelling so that we don't get to these harder points. Our main thing is, right? So when you reinforce a lower level behavior, your child does not need to try out any of these behaviors at a higher level. The other thing is when your child is at a lower level behavior, they're generally calmer and they're more open to learning new skills. And I want to go back to that example of, when your Zoom call doesn't go through or when your phone call doesn't go through, right? If I've called my mom to have a really important conversation and we're having trouble connecting, by the time that connection is so bad and I've tried recalling tons of times, I am so frustrated that I don't want to have the conversation that I initially called to have, right? I am just over it. I'm ready to hang up the phone and just go do something else because I've had enough of technology for today. That's kind of what it feels like to get to this higher level of behavior, right? We're not available to learn. There's other things going on. No one's paying attention to me. Whereas at the smaller level of behavior is when we can really learn and start to teach these skills that are more appropriate, right? Maybe that is the functional communication that Tan spoke about, but maybe it's also a different appropriate way to get somebody's attention, right? So if we're turning that yell into a look, that's going to be easier. We've taught them a new skill. We didn't have to put their stuff on extinction and we didn't have to enter the danger zone up here. Who would this strategy be good for? This would be a really good strategy for a child who has not yet developed a reliable means of communicating or is not yet reliable with following models to communicate, right? So a child that doesn't know how to echo, right? Some kids you can say to them, hey, say, look at me. And they'll right away tell you, look at me, super easy, you can reinforce that. But you'd want to use this kind of a strategy for a child who may not know how to echo or may not know how to use picture cards to communicate or may not have a different means of communicating so that you can teach them a good way to get somebody's attention at when they're calm. Some considerations for reinforcing low-level behavior, right? Just like we looked at with that functional communication, you want to look at your child's current language level, right? Whatever you're shaping that behavior, that initial behavior into becoming, you want to make sure it's not so frustrating for your student and it goes well with their current communication level. The next thing you want to look at is, will everyone in your child's life honor this communication, right? Especially if we're looking at, turning a hit on the shoulder into a tap on the shoulder. Can you tell the child's teacher and the child's brother, hey, if Johnny taps you on the shoulder, he wants your attention, please look at him and please ask him what he wants. Are you available to be a listener, right? If, you're on a Zoom calls all day and, you're turning you're needing to reinforce your child's low level behaviors, you want to make sure that you are able to reinforce those low level behaviors, that you are available to listen to them, because reinforcing low level behaviors does rely on being able to do that when they are still in a calm state. And then you, of course, want to have an immediate plan for how you will turn that low level behavior into an appropriate response. And this is something you can work with your behavior analyst on. Creative ways to think about how your child can communicate that they want your attention. Because, yelling is not something we want to see forever. It does get frustrating and it isn't appropriate. So we want to have a plan for how we can turn that into something more appropriate.
So now that we've talked about all these strategies, let's talk a little bit about how they fit into the behaviors or your daily life. When the behavior is not happening, the key phrase is catch your child being good. We say that often, which just means catch them doing the behaviors that you want to see more of and provide reinforcers for it, be it phrase, toys, activities, whatever. And by encouraging the behavior that we do want to see instead of just discouraging the ones we don't want to see, we have more opportunities to effectively and quickly build up those communications or delay and denial tolerance skills. Within delay or denial, that's a whole other thing, but if there's more of a ratio of them being reinforced when there is a delay, it's less impactful. And remember that these challenging behaviors are useful things for your child. They are something that they are doing to get a need met. And it won't just go away if we ignore it. We have to teach them another way to get what they want. And we can do that through continually encouraging the behaviors that we do want to see. And especially like Tammy was saying earlier, when they're calm and they're having a good time. So when you're playing with them, it's a really good time to practice the play skills, the communication skills, social skills, all the leisure skills. And then find times to provide them extra attention when the behavior is not happening, and try to shift that scale a little bit towards the more appropriate behaviors. And next slide. When the behavior is happening, it's important to try to stay as calm as you can, or if it's safe to do so, take a moment away to get yourself calm. So when you are calm, you are less likely to react strongly, and you can avoid adding high quality attention to the behavior. You are also more likely to be able to clearly think about what you do want them to do, the replacement behavior that you've chosen, and then determine what your kid wants from you, the reinforcer. Once you are able to figure that out, then you can effectively follow through with your chosen intervention, be it reinforcing at the low rate or the functional communication, or a combination of both. If you have gotten to a higher level of behavior, just make sure everybody's safe, make sure you're safe and they're safe, and just be easy on yourself. This is something that happens, and it's hard and it's frustrating, and we don't need to be harder on ourselves than we have to be. And after the behavior happens, we can take some time to reevaluate. If you feel like it would be helpful for you to keep track and put things into perspective, you can also write it down. It doesn't have to be anything lengthy, kind of just what was going on, how did they respond, how did I respond. Some of you might have had some experience with ABC data with your behavior analysts. It's something like that. And you can ask yourself some questions. What would you do the same or differently next time? Did you or them react in a way that felt okay or sustainable to you? Would you be able to react similarly after a long, stressful day if you felt like that response that you had planned for your intervention, if you felt like, oh, that took a lot of willpower and energy for me to be able to respond that way, and if I'm coming home after a hard day, I'm not sure if I can do that, that's okay to figure that out and discuss with your behavior analyst and try to figure a different way. And next was what you thought they wanted actually what you wanted, or actually what they wanted, was that the reinforcer for the behavior? So when you gave them what you thought was what they were asking for, did the behavior stop? Or did they engage in other behaviors and then you gave them something else and then it stopped? Or did you respond one way and then you then responded differently? Or you tried it, you said a couple of things, you did some other stuff and then it stopped? What seemed to stop the behavior from happening? And then last, if their reaction was a high level intense reaction, were there some less intense behaviors leading up to it? Do they usually engage in those behaviors before that intense reaction? And if you had answered yes to both, that yes, it was a dangerous or destructive or unsafe response, and yes, they usually do these couple of things before they do that big reaction, those would be your precursor behaviors, that the things that they commonly do, like Tammy was saying, that quick look to the door before they bolt. So next time when you see those precursor behaviors, you can prompt appropriate asking or give enforcers give reinforcers depending on your intervention. And
Right. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Tan. I'm Dr. Barbara Koninsky. On behalf of Greenbox ABA, I'd like to thank you all for viewing this workshop recording. Please feel free to check out our other recorded workshops on our YouTube channel and on our webpage, and also to check the webpage for upcoming workshops. Thank you and have a great day.